Welcome to Dis and Dat, 13 May. We're looking at Karl Marx, Volume 1, the 2024 edition. We're blessed with a set of notes that uses this edition, so the page numbers sort of work out. I hope you'll find that to your advantage. Yesterday, we plowed along up through chapter 11. We'll start with chapter 12, get through that, and then if we have a little time, we'll look at the PowerPoint from the Polylux Marx folks at the Rosa Luxemburg Center. Chapter 12, the division of labor and the manufacturing system. Marx discusses two ways in which craft workers or artisanal workers are brought together in the new manufacturing system. Pages 308 to 309. Note that this means that the manufacturing system will ultimately have a narrow technological foundation. Bottom of 310. Marx discusses here the inefficiencies of artisanal workers working with their tools and the consequences of a lifetime of sticking to one's last, which we will remember was Plato's answer to what justice is. Bringing them into a system of manufacture and changing their division of labor does reduce the labor time to make a commodity, but it begins to turn workers into cogs in a machine. Now, Marx got here before Mario Savio, page 319 to 21. Note here that the analysis of how the labor process is structured to de-skill us. Here, capital finds it cheaper not to train all workers for complex tasks, but to break down work into simpler tasks, leaving only a few for which some workers must have expensive training. The majority of workers do simple work. They're easily replaceable. It is not in response to people's fixed or inborn nature or inherent capabilities that the division of labor takes form, as Plato imagined with his myth of metals. People are rather adapted to the most cost-efficient form of the division of labor. Now, how does Marx compare the division of labor within a manufacturing workshop and the division of labor within society? What are the relevant differences here? This is page 327. What is the fate of the worker in the manufacturing workshop? Page 331 to 2. How does Marx compare the ancient Greek defense of the division of labor to the defense of the divisions of labor created within manufacturing workshops? Page 337. Chapter 13, Machinery and Large-Scale Industry. Differentiating machines from tools, which are but a part of a machine. Pages 342 to 4. Marx underlines that machines liberate capital from dependence on the motive power, the limits of the human body, and the specialized skills of most workers. 352, page 352. Machines are used to produce machines, and capital has now effected a real subsumption of the production process to the demands of valorization. The productivity of machines or the labor that they save is astounding. See pages 360 to 61. Yet capital puts a limit on the full use of technical knowledge to make and adopt machines. What is that limit? See pages 361 to 2. Why does machinery enable the entry of women and children into the factory? And why does that raise the rate of surplus value 364? Why does machinery lead to the legal revolution or counter-revolution of the annulment of the contract as the basic legal relation among people? Page 366. Why does machinery, that is the most powerful means for reducing the labor time needed to make a commodity, become as a bearer of capital, the most powerful means of extending the workday beyond natural limits? Page 371. What role does moral depreciation, page 373, have in this result? 373 to 77. In what ways are workers living appendages of machines? Pages 390 to 91. How can machines become hostile to workers and serve as strike breakers? Page 401 to 2. How does Marx describe the social consequences of the transition from manufacturing workshops put under great competitive pressure from machine factories to a machine or to a mechanic system of production? How could the workers' understanding of their variable nature change? Pages 445 to 50 and 458 to 9. Upon pain of adaptation to an ever-changing work landscape, workers discover that they're not born to stick with their respective lasts and need not with a good general education. They too can become an independent source of creative destruction, just as Marx had lauded the bourgeoisie for being. Why does Marx think capitalist production steals from the worker and the soil? Page 461. Chapter 14. Absolute and relative surplus value. See page 470 for what can be called a Goldilocks theory of the European physical environment and geography for the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. It's just tough enough to make people creatively exert their efforts. In private correspondence, Engels would rightly try to talk Marx out of this physical determinism as a form of materialism. Chapter 15. The price of labor power and the magnitude of surplus value increase and decrease. Note that in analyzing what determines the magnitudes of surplus value and labor power's price, Marx himself understands that the price of labor can drop and the value of labor power fall in relation to surplus value, i.e., workers can become more exploited and the workers' means of subsistence can keep getting larger. Read the full paragraph on page 477. I have suggested that workers could find their increasing exploitation in Marx's terms irrelevant to their assessment of their life conditions, materially improving as they may be. In short, why may what Marx would describe as a rising rate of exploitation not necessarily be experienced as oppressive by workers? Note how the increasing intensity of work, something that can be accomplished today due to a better surveillance of every physical move, think of ankle bracelets in a warehouse, or keystroke, increases the production of surplus value, page 478. Chapter 16, different formulas for the rate of surplus value. Now, why does representing surplus value and labor power's value as a fraction of the value produced obscure the specific character of the capital relation? Page 486. Chapter 17, how the value and price of labor power are transformed into wages. On page 493, Marx raises the epistemological problem that capitalist system objectively appears in a misleading way or spontaneously generates illusions. In his terms, the categories we use are based on the, quote, forms of appearance that essential relations take, unquote. But, quote, things often appear in such a way that they present themselves as the opposite of what they are, as every branch of science and scholarship knows, every branch except political economy, unquote. That is, the skeptical approach that Galileo took to the geocentric conception of the solar system. That is, the sun does appear to rise and set from any position on an apparently stationary Earth, Marx takes to the study of political economy. Now, this is a little overstated, but Marx imagines himself as the Galileo of the social sciences. His case study of this is that there appears on the market to be a value of labor for which wages are paid. The wage form thus erases the division of the workday into parts when necessary, and surplus labor, paid and unpaid labor, are performed. The appearance dissimulates the essential relation. So see in particular 495 to 6 and 498. Now, Marx also explores in later volumes how price does objectively appear not to be regulated by labor value, although it is indirectly, and in the last instance, according to him, why mechanization does objectively appear to be the best source of surplus value, not the exploitation of labor, why, as we have seen, the wage appears to be determined by the value of labor and why a crisis appears to have been caused by a shortage of money or a deficiency of consumer demand. The objective illusion is Marx's key epistemological category. Chapter 18, Time Wages. On page 501, Marx notes that capital wants to pay only for the time that workers work, or the time that it would take them to reproduce for the ability to do the work that they do, not necessarily a wage that would enable them to reproduce their lives. Digital technology today enables work to be scheduled in response to peak demand, not necessarily in a regular way. How can a capitalist schedule workers, think today through digital tools, such that the wage earned is not sufficient to reproduce labor power? Number 19, chapter 19, peace wages. Note how peace wages can force the worker to intensify and elongate their work. Can be seen in the trucking industry, in which truckers are often paid by the mile that they drive, not for the time that they have worked. If truckers are paid per mile driven and not for the hours that the truck must be idle for inspections and due to traffic, and the number of hours they can drive is limited by statute, how could this form of peace wages lead to trouble? See page 510. Chapter 20, Variations in Wages from Nation to Nation. See page 516 for how the world market will reward the nation in which the intensity of labor is relatively high. Page 516. Chapter 21, Simple Reproduction. In the introduction to this part, page 519, Marx makes clear why he uses the term surplus value rather than profit. Out of surplus value will not only profit derive, but interest and ground rent as well. After defining simple reproduction on page 522, Marx makes one of his least appreciated but most daring arguments, that the very repetition of the exchange between capital and labor over time changes the content of that relationship. It now only appears as an exchange relationship of value for value, or as a quid pro quo, but has become a tributary one in which capital withholds the wage out of the value that labor has produced, but that capital appropriates unless workers pledge to produce surplus value again. Again, the relationship still appears as one of exchange or a quid pro quo relationship, but an analysis of the relationship only at the macro level over time reveals that the relationship between the collective capitalists and collective workers has changed in content. See pages 522 to 524 and 526, and also 528 for a penetrating analysis of why the independence of the worker who makes a work contract apparently freely and is thus bound by it is a fictio juris. This is one of the more difficult arguments that Marx makes, so read this slowly. Chapter 22, How Surplus Value is Transformed into Capital. The capitalist has a dilemma of whether to spend the surplus value as revenue or to capitalize it as additional constant and variable capital, i.e., accumulate. On page 542, Marx gives the bourgeoisie the historical mission of accumulation to a hitherto unprecedented extent. On pages 544 to 46, Marx gives one of the most memorable character sketches of the capitalist ever written. See page 553 for why the rate of accumulation may well accelerate. Chapter 23, The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. If capital accumulates extensively, say it builds new factories with the same ratio of machines to workers, then the system may run into a shortage of labor at some point, giving rise to a cycle of expansion and contraction. In biology today, this is called a predator-prey dynamic and modeled with the Lotka-Volterra differential equations. Marx's description of this dynamic is verbal. See page 568. Marx is interested in how capital balances its expansiveness with its voracious appetite for surplus value. He captures how the balance is maintained to capital's advantage without being the intention of any actor in the system. Page 569. What does Marx mean by the organic composition of capital? Page 570. What does Marx mean by the concentration and centralization of capital? Page 574. How does capital accumulation depend on and itself create a relative surplus population or industrial reserve army of labor? Pages 575 to 93. What does Marx mean by the general law of accumulation? Pages 589 and 593. Now, note again that the very process of mechanization that enables a rising S over V with the cheapening of wage goods, the necessary part of the workday falls relative to surplus labor time, also means variable capital falls as a proportion of rising capital outlays. This, in turn, reduces the rate at which the absolute demand for labor rises, and that in turn engenders a rising relative surplus population or reserve army of labor. The demand for labor does not rise pari passu with the growth of the proletarian population itself, the result of multiple factors, that is, the expropriation of peasants and craftsmen, as well as reduced infant mortality, we could add. Marx provides a nuanced disaggregation of the relative surplus population. He wants to show how it's both a result of capital accumulation and a precondition for it. Otherwise, labor would not be available for the fits and starts of capital accumulation. The forms of the relative surplus population include A, the top stratum of often skilled workers who are only periodically unemployed. B, the latent reserve army of labor who may be underemployed in rural production and can be recruited during long upswings in capitalist production. C, a stagnant layer at the margins of the society of active laborers but willing to work. And D, a surplus population becomes incapable of work and falls into a sub-proletariat. Let me rely on Pietro Basso's summary of the argument. Quote, Marx's main field of investigation is Great Britain, although at the end of chapter 25, this shifts to Ireland, where Marx's study founds similar phenomena to those facing the English rural proletariat. In fact, the formation of a relative surplus population and an industrial reserve army depends on the general laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production, a mode which, for the first time in history, has made existential insecurity of the working masses and chronic poverty of broad layers among them a, quote, normal phenomenon of society. Now, this process occurred in both England and Ireland, which Marx analyzed first separately and then in their colonial relationship. And we subsequently find the process again in every other country taken over by capitalism. This is evidently the case in the global South today, where the all-out development of capitalist relations of production under the aegis of agribusiness multinationals is leading to massive emigration from the countryside, 30 to 40 million people a year at an unprecedented pace. Quote, the Industrial Reserve Army is a product of capitalist development, but also its precondition in the sense that it's always available at any moment to satisfy just in time the changing needs of capital accumulation. This is essential in periods of stagnation or crisis, as well as periods of productive paroxysm, since in both cases, it puts pressure on the active army of labor by curbing its demands and containing or lowering the average value of labor power through no choice of the workers, of course. Marx's analysis here rounds off his definition of the, quote, absolute general law of capitalist accumulation, unquote, valid for all countries and all stages of this mode of production and reproduction of the life of society. The greater the social wealth, the functioning capital, the extent and energy of its growth, the greater is the Industrial Reserve Army. This nexus connecting capital accumulation, active army of labor, and the Industrial Reserve Army has a profound effect on the terrain of class struggle. It rivets the worker to capital more firmly than the wedges of Hephaestus held Prometheus to the rock. The orderly functioning of this mechanism, which permanently divides the class living from wage labor and fuels competition between the employed and the unemployed or underemployed, is of fundamental importance for capital. For centuries now, it's supplied it with policies and imagery that have tended to enrich the dividing lines between the two armies of labor. This is why Marx, a sworn enemy of the modern chains for the exploitation of human labor, unconditionally promotes planned cooperation between the employed and the unemployed in order to obviate or weaken the ruinous effects of this natural law of capitalist accumulation on their class. For every combination between employed and unemployed disturbs the pure action of this law. For Marx, therefore, number one, the production of an industrial reserve army is a law, not a passing accident or dysfunction of capitalism linked to this or that social policy, or to keep with our main theme, this or that policy on migration. And number two, the only force that can challenge it is the combined struggle of the employed and the unemployed. To omit this twofold political and historical theoretical conclusion is brazenly to falsify Marx's and Marxist theory on the question. Now, you can skip the case studies at the end of the chapter, but the last paragraph on the surprising consequences of the migration of the Irish Reserve Army of Labor to the United States is provocative. Chapter 24, the so-called original accumulation. Marx has clarified how the capital relation reproduces its own production conditions of possibility, i.e., the valorization of capital reproduces Mr. Moneybags, who, in virtue of his ownership of the produced commodities, has capital to invest again, and proletarians who, in virtue of the full use of their wage to reproduce their labor power, must sell their labor power again. That is, Marx has been interested in capitalism as a self-constraining system of production, i.e., as a system that has to produce the conditions necessary to reproduce itself again. This means not only the reproduction of the class relation, but also the production of the capital goods, or machinery, and wage goods that will be needed for the next cycle of accumulation and production. This latter feature is analyzed in the reproduction schema in Capital, Volume 2. But Marx does not think the capitalist system was born as Venus fully grown. It was the result of a violent, protracted process. It did not have fairy tale beginnings, so people who find it just today because they believe it came into existence through just transactions depend on myths of its origins, not its real history of birth. Marx dispels myths of where the capital and the propertyless workers came from in the first place. Excuse me. To create this self-reproducing system of exploitation. Marx will show that this order, apparently based on property rights meant to secure ownership of one's labor, originated in the open violation of any property rights people should have had and did have. Marx's previous analysis was meant to show, inter alia, that the system, in its maturity, has turned into an empty shell of the property rights on which it claims to stand. That is because, due to its ownership of the means of production, capital is in a position to offer just the wage to labor in a quid pro quo to get the full value of what labor will produce. Property rights thus protect the theft of alien or surplus labor time. At its beginning, capital openly and nakedly violated property rights to turn peasants and yeomen into propertyless workers available for capital to exploit. See, for example, the bottom of pages 659 to 70. The second paragraph of 662 on ear clipping. In this original phase, capital also denied the incipient proletarian class the freedom to bargain for wages and make contracts. See the brutal details in the second paragraph on 668 and the first full paragraph on 672. Marx makes two interesting points in the course of this analysis. First, the propertyless and vulnerable condition that workers take as natural or inscribed in the human condition required huge dollops of violence to bring about, pages 670 and 688 to 89. And second, the coercive laws that enabled capital to bring workers to heel. This system, not of the rule of law, but rule by law, sinisterly remain on the books long after the system has come into maturity, page 674. As for where the original sum of capital derived that kick-started the system, Marx finds its source in conquest, whether by the state or private trading companies, slavery, war profiteering, protectionism, and opium trading, page 682. The key theme is that the use of the concentrated and organized violence of the state quickens a transition in the mode of production, a line that is foreboding for the future of socialism and implicates Marx, at least here, in the violence employed to achieve communism in the 20th century. Marx underlines that the system of factory labor in England was made possible by the enormous supply of cotton produced by enslaved Africans in America. In fact, the veiled slavery endured by factory workers rests on a brutal and open system of slavery converted from a patriarchal institution into a ruthlessly commercial one, page 688. Having laid bare the violence by which the capitalist system was birthed, Marx analyzes capitalism as a dialectical process by which the large capitals that expropriated smaller capitals and dispossessed the peasantry will themselves be fully expropriated by a class of proletarians that no other than capital has brought into existence. Again, Marx is implicated in the violence and expropriation by which 20th century communism came into existence. That Marx reads this as the inexorable logic of capital's motion should not free him or Marxists of responsibility for the consequences of their action. Chapter 25, where we are coming up to where we are this week. Modern theory of colonization. Marx emphasizes that capital is not a sum of money, new wage goods, or new machines. These things are all part of the circuit of capital. But without the relation between capitalists and workers, none of those things are elements of the circuit of capital. This is simply what the Australian colonist Wakefield discovers, page 694. Marx repeats this point on page 697 by again saying that without the reproduction of the dependence of wage laborers on capital, the circuit of capital cannot be commenced and renewed. In short, the economy is not understood well as a collection of independent factors for production, an atomistic ontology. What exists are independent things and individuals, but a specific and dynamic kind of self-reproducing relation between classes. The relation is as real as the classes and the individuals in those classes. So that gets us to the end. There's a supplement 1, the continuous depreciation of unit values. It's a graphical way of understanding Marx's insistence on an inverse movement in the quantity of use values and the value of each unit produced. An outward shift of the supply curve indicates that producers can produce given quantities at cheaper costs and are thus willing to sell at cheaper prices. Remember, for Marx, supply costs are reducible to labor costs. Producers can thus create greater demand now, not in the first instance by whetting appetites, but by making a given quantity cheaper to produce. What an outward shift in the supply curve usually expresses is that labor productivity has risen, so it takes less total labor time to produce units of a good. The costs of producing a unit can be brought down by mechanization because the machines that are used took less labor time to build than the direct working time they make unnecessary. The overall labor cost of producing each unit falls, and so does the money cost of producing each unit. This means the supply curve shifts outward as producers are willing to supply determinate quantities at lower prices. The labor theory of value can be understood as a dynamic cost of production theory of price with changes in labor time and thus cost conditions driving changes in the market. So the way to understand Marx is this. Due to the cobweb theorem, supply may undershoot and then overshoot demand or vice versa. So equilibrium is not immediately reached. This is a very important point. Hog farmers must decide 1 year ahead of time how much they will want to put on the market in the next year, a decision that is determined by the price they expect hogs to fetch and the cost of producing them. An increase in expected price will induce farmers to produce more, as reflected in the upward sloping supply curve in figure 17.3. Assume that in year 1, the price for hogs is P1. Expecting that prices will remain the same in year 2, farmers put Q2 on the market next year. At this volume, however, the market clearing price is P2 rather than P1. Expecting that prices will remain at that level in year 3, farmers produce volume Q3 for that year. The market clearing price will be P3, inducing farmers to produce Q4 in year 4, etc. In this case, prices and volumes form an outward spiral or alternate with unpleasant ones, but the expected outcome never occurs. If the relative slopes of the supply and demand curves are modified, the result could be an inward spiral converging to the equilibrium price P asterisk, P starred, and equilibrium volume Q starred. There is something irrational about the behavior of the farmers. Each of them believes that he is free to vary his output to maximize his profits while tacitly assuming that others are just as mechanically doing what they did last year. Now, perhaps irrational, the behavior is certainly intelligible. A French philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, said that our spontaneous tendency is to view other people as younger siblings. We do not easily impute to others the same capacity for deliberation and reflection that introspection tells us that we possess ourselves, nor, for that matter, our inner turmoil, doubts, and anguishes. See Chapter 22. The idea of viewing others as being just as strategic and calculating as we are ourselves does not seem to come naturally. This next section is from John Elster explaining social behavior. My idea is this: as system undershoots and overshoots, some producers will have introduced new, more productive techniques so that the supply curve shifts outward, and the system will now begin circling around a new equilibrium before it ever came to a rest at the previous equilibrium point. And before that is reached, the supply curve will have shifted outward again. Marx is a theorist of perpetual disruption and endemic disequilibrium as a result of the continuous depreciation of unit values. He is a theorist of dynamic disequilibrium. Supplemental material 2. Why capital must grow to increase profits. There's a short discussion of a problem raised in Capital Volume 3. John Strachey, with the verbal description, quote, Marx supplies a formula for this necessary minimum rate of accumulation which must be attained unless the amount of profit is to decline and the system to stall. Quote, in order that the mass of profit made at a declining rate of profit may remain the same as before, the multiplier indicating the growth of the new total capital must be equal to the multiplier indicating the growth of the total capital, or must be equal to the divisor indicating the fall of the rate of profit. But Marx writes accumulation must just be a little faster than this. It must be at least fast enough to make the amount of profit not only stay the same, but to grow a little from year to year. In spite of the fall in the rate of profit, for otherwise there'll be no incentive for the capitalists in the whole business of accumulation. This is the formula of the minimum rate of accumulation necessary to capitalism. If ever and wherever the rate of accumulation falls below this level, the system must and does jam. For it becomes more profitable for the capitalist to restrict than to expand production, and unless it pays the capitalist better to use more capital and give more employment, they will use less capital and give less employment. We've established the fact that there exists for any capitalist economy a certain minimum rate of accumulation, a certain minimum speed, that is to say, at which its total capital must grow if the system is to function. And we have established the fact that this minimum rate of accumulation is determined by the speed at which small v over small c is falling, by the spread, that is to say, of technical progress. Quote, this is a conclusion of the utmost importance, for it, and it alone, enables us to understand why it's impossible to solve the fundamental difficulty, the basis and ever-recurrent crisis of capitalism in the simple way advocated by all reformers. The essence of every crisis is very visibly a glut. Why then, say the reformers, cannot this glut be cured by the simple, obvious expedient of, quote, distributing purchasing power, unquote? How can it be maintained that a policy of high wages combined, and if necessary, with the institution of social services, would not solve the problem by giving everybody the money to buy the available goods and so end the glut? At length, we can clearly say why this policy cannot be adopted. It creates these are all the little pieces that you're going to be confronted. It cannot be adopted because to raise wages or to increase taxation in order to pay for social services would at once begin to diminish the rate of accumulation. It would make it impossible for the capitalists to augment their total capital at a pace sufficient to offset the fall in little v over little c, and so achieve that indispensable purpose, some growth in the absolute magnitude of v. Quote, it is clear, moreover, that it is just precisely today, when technical progress is proceeding at an unequaled rate, when the bottom is dropping out of little v over little c, that every available penny must be devoted to accumulation. And this why, as we've already seen, the capitalists in actual practice, far from trying to cure the recurrent gluts of the system by increasing the non-capitalist purchasing power, apply the paradoxical remedy of reducing everybody's purchasing power either by cutting wages or extent. Now, indeed, we saw that the whole dispute between the different schools of capitalist economics turned out to be concerned exclusively with the question of which of these methods of reducing purchasing power should be adopted. And in math, it looks like this, and I won't bore you, but you should look at the question of, you know, issues about wages and its relationship to machinery, for example. Note here that capitalism has a powerful inbuilt tendency towards growth that has engendered, but does not necessarily entail, a rising material throughput at odds presently with biosphere. There is now sharp controversy over whether Marx began to explore a degrowth path for post-capitalist society due to the costs of growth on nature and workers alike. Supplemental Material 3, Modeling the Accumulation of Capital. Well, he mentions an Excel sheet that is not necessarily available, although I might ask him. And just so you have an image of what Rakesh Bandari looks like, it's a fairly recent video of him. And then I included all of the stuff from Polylux Marx that we looked at yesterday. That is to look at, over 100 slides, and it is a useful history, problematic for all the usual kinds of reasons, but still worth considering. And in the simple case, we ask certain kinds of questions. Um, for example, the dog barking and coming to the door, not necessarily, a habitus in that sense. Now, why is it that we read Capital today? Well, because it's still relevant. Marx asks the question, what makes capitalism capitalism? He does not examine a particular country, for example, English capitalism around 1860, or a particular era, for example, the beginnings of industrialization. Rather, the object is the capitalist mode of production at its quote unquote ideal average. 1970, I'll wager. However, capitalism always exists in a concrete historical manifestation. Marx's analysis exists at an abstract level. However, there are different interpretations of capital concerning questions such as how did capitalism historically emerge? And how did it develop? How did capitalism during the 19th century function? How does capitalism, and sort of snarkily, um, function? The emergence of capital. Capital was not cast from a single mold. Marx created several drafts of capital. Between 1857 and 79, various manuscripts emerged. Marx struggled with the fire of the material, or ancillary fires from the material. Between 1857 and 1879, various manuscripts emerged. Marx struggled with the material, some of which he discarded, other parts of which he rewrote in an effort to state his thoughts more precisely. The first volume of Capital was published in 1867. The existing English translations are based on the fourth German edition, revised and published by Engels in 1890. The third edition is based on a manuscript that existed before the publication of the first volume. The second volume is based on manuscripts composed later. All three volumes we are familiar with were unknown to Marx. The work was uncompleted by its author. Thank you, Engels. Marx wrote over the course of his lifetime, nearly a half century, continuously developed his analysis, and the object of his analysis also changed. Only a few of his texts on economic theory were published during his lifetime. The texts published after Marx's death were edited and revised. For example, the second and third volumes of Capital by Friedrich Engels, Theories of Surplus Value by Karl Kautsky, and published over several decades. The history of the reception of Marx's work is complex and depends on various historical and political contexts, as well as the availability of certain texts. Critique of Political Economy. A critique of political economy is the subtitle of Capital. Political economy is the historical term for what we now call economics. Marx criticizes the very foundations of political economy, not just some of its theories, hypotheses, or findings. The critique of political economy is also a critique of bourgeois society and its class relations. Marx criticizes the very foundations of political economy, not just some of its theories, hypotheses, or findings. The critique of political economy is also a critique of bourgeois society and its class relations. The type of analysis to prevent possible misunderstandings, let me say this. I do not by any means depict the capitalist and the landowner in rosy colors, but individuals are dealt with here only insofar as they are the personifications of economic categories, the bearers of particular class relations and interests. It's on page 92. An analysis of capitalism in the Marxian sense means first determining the social relations that force a certain behavioral rationality onto individuals, not starting with individual motivations and calculations, and understanding critically how people act as capitalists or as workers. A critique of capitalism follows from this analysis, not a scolding of capitalists. And you can see here, there is the three volumes have a structure. Volume 1 is the simple circulation of commodities. Volume 2 is the process of the circulation of capital, that is, the process of capitalist production. That is the process of the circulation of capital. You can see how that's structured. MLPMP, P dot 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 C prime slash or leads to M prime. The process of capitalist production as a whole is what constitutes volume 3. Now, this is the one way in which you can talk about the structure of volume 1. And, you're leaping through a lot of different things. That is chapters 7 to 24. Now, that's a lot of chapters. And it's more than simply the immediate process of the production, reproduction, and accumulation of individuals. It's more about total social capital. And, of course, to accommodate the question of capital accumulation versus primitive or pre-capitalist accumulation. And so, indeed, history gets put at the end. What's more important is working out the relations among characters. It's also similarly positioned relative to the idea that you want to think about how all of this fits together. So, anyway, I got to the end. Let me see if there's any comments in chat. No, there isn't. We're close to the end. Let me stop share and stop